Their Maya-chan had been dreaming about this vacation for 3 years now, and she could barely contain her excitement as the shuttle descended through the clouds of Velith 4. Working as a xenobiologist on Tethys Station was fascinating work, but it was also exhausting, and the endless metal corridors and recycled air had slowly worn her down until she felt like a plant desperate for sunlight now. She finally had 2 weeks of shore leave on what travel guides called the most beautiful moon in the outer colonies, and she intended to enjoy every single moment of it. The garden moon of Velith 4 was everything the brochures had promised, and more crystalline forests stretched across rolling hills where trees made of living mineral structures caught the light and scattered it into rainbows that danced across the ground bioluminescent. Meadows glowed with soft blues and purples, even in daylight, and strange flowers released spores that sparkled like glitter as they floated through the warm air. Maya had rented a small cabin near one of the most popular hiking areas, and she spent her first morning simply sitting in the grass and breathing air that smelled like honey and rain. She was 34 years old, and she had worked harder than most people could imagine to get where she was, and this moment of peace felt like a reward she had truly earned. The sound of engines broke through her meditation, and she looked up to see a sleek shuttle descending toward a clearing about 200 meters away. The vessel was Karathi in design, with smooth curves and an iridescent hull that shifted colors as it moved through the air. Maya watched with mild curiosity as the shuttle landed and a boarding ramp extended down to the grass. What emerged was pure chaos wrapped in scales and excitement. 23 Karathi children came pouring out of the shuttle like water bursting from a dam, and their high-pitched voices filled the air with chatter and laughter. The Karathi were a relatively new species in the Galactic Collective, having achieved interstellar travel only about 40 years ago, and Maya had worked with several of their scientists during her time on Tethys Station. They were pleasant people in her experience, with iridescent scales that covered their compact bodies and large dark eyes that could see into spectrums humans could only dream of. Their children were apparently just as energetic and uncontrollable as human children, which made Maya smile. Hurried-looking adult Karathi followed the children down the ramp, and Maya could practically see the stress radiating off of her. This was clearly the teacher, and she was clearly outnumbered. "Stay together, please," the teacher called out in her translator-assisted voice, and her tone suggested she had said these words approximately 10,000 times already today. Children paid her about as much attention as human children would have, which is to say, almost none at all. They scattered across the meadow in small groups, pointing at flowers and chasing the floating spores, and generally behaving like young beings anywhere in the galaxy who had been cooped up in a shuttle for too long. Maya chuckled softly and returned her attention to her datapad, where she was cataloging some of the plant life she had photographed that morning. Humans were even newer to the galactic community than the Karathi, with barely 15 years having passed since first contact, and Maya still sometimes felt like a guest at a party where everyone else had known each other for centuries. But moments like this reminded her that some things were universal across all species. Children would always be children, and teachers would always be exhausted. She glanced up occasionally to watch the field trip unfold, and found herself charmed by the little Karathi students. They moved with a slightly waddling gait that came from bodies evolved for both land and water, and their scales flashed with colors that seemed to indicate their emotional states. Right now, most of them were flashing bright yellows and oranges, which Maya guessed meant happiness or excitement. The teacher, who wore a small badge identifying her as Instructor Velises, was trying to gather them for what looked like an educational lecture about the crystal formations. Maya remembered field trips from her own childhood and felt a pang of sympathy for the poor instructor. Getting children to focus on learning when they were surrounded by wonders was a battle that teachers have been fighting since the beginning of civilization. She made a mental note to stay out of their way and let them enjoy their excursion in peace. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, and Maya stretched out on the soft grass feeling more relaxed than she had in years. The crystalline trees around her hummed, faintly with a natural resonance that was almost musical, as she let her eyes drift close. This was exactly what she needed: no emergencies to handle, and no samples to analyze, and no reports to file, just peace and beauty, and the simple pleasure of existing in a moment. She was just beginning to doze off when she felt a vibration in the ground beneath her that was different from the gentle hum of the crystal forests. This was deeper and wronger, somehow like the moon itself was groaning in pain. Maya sat up quickly, her scientist instincts overriding her vacation brain, and she pressed her palm flat against the grass to feel the tremor more clearly. It was getting stronger. She had studied Velith 4's geology extensively before her trip, because she was the kind of person who researched everything, and she knew for a fact that this moon was tectonically stable. There had not been a significant seismic event here in over 10,000 years, so why was the ground shaking? The crystalline trees around her began to resonate with the vibration, and the musical hum turned into something that sounded almost like a warning bell. Maya scrambled to her feet and looked toward the Karathi group instructor. Velis had noticed the tremors too, and she was gathering the children with urgent gestures and commands, but they were on the wrong side of a small ridge, and their shuttle was on the other side, and Maya could see that the ground between them was starting to crack. She opened her mouth to shout a warning, but before she could make a sound, the meadow split open. A fissure tore through the earth between Maya's position and the Karathi group, and it widened with a grinding roar that drowned out the screaming children. Maya watched in horror as the beautiful meadow transformed into a nightmare, and she realized that her peaceful vacation had just become something else entirely. The ground beneath the smallest children began to crumble, and Maya was running before she even made the conscious decision to move. Maya ran faster than she had ever run in her life, and the world around her seemed to slow down as her body pumped adrenaline through her veins. The fissure was widening between her and the Karathi children, but she did not stop to calculate the distance or consider the risks. 3 of the smallest children were standing on a section of ground that was visibly collapsing, and their scales had turned a pale gray color that Maya instinctively knew meant terror. Instructor Velis was screaming something in her native language and reaching toward the children, but she was too far away, and the ground between them was breaking apart. Maya reached the edge of the fissure and jumped without hesitation. The gap was perhaps 3 meters at this point, and on Earth it would have been an easy leap for any reasonably fit human. But Maya was not on Earth, and she was not thinking about physics or biomechanics. She was thinking about those 3 small children who were about to fall into darkness. Her feet hit the unstable ground on the other side, and she felt it shift beneath her weight. But she did not slow down. She reached the first child and scooped him up under her arm, and his small body was lighter than she expected. The second child was frozen in place with fear, and Maya grabbed her too and tucked her against her other side. The third child was the smallest of all, and she was crying and reaching up with her tiny webbed hands, and Maya shouted at her to climb onto her back. The little one obeyed immediately, wrapping her arms around Maya's neck and clinging tight. The ground beneath Maya's feet tilted sharply, and she could hear rocks tumbling into the depths below. She turned and ran toward solid ground with 3 alien children clinging to her body and the earth crumbling at her heels. The edge of the sinkhole was just ahead, but it was rising as the center collapsed, and Maya had to jump again. She launched herself upward with all the strength in her legs, and for a moment, she was airborne with 3 terrified children counting on her to save them. Her hands caught the edge of stable ground, and her fingers dug into the soil and grass, and she hung there for a heartbeat before hauling herself up. The 3 children tumbled off of her onto solid ground, and they immediately scrambled away from the edge with their scales flashing in panicked patterns. Maya allowed herself Exactly 1 second to catch her breath before she looked back at the rest of the group. What she saw made her heart sink. The karate class was now stranded on an island of stable ground that was surrounded by widening cracks on all sides. Their shuttle was visible in the distance, but there was no way to reach it and the ground between them. And safety was a maze of fissures and unstable sections. Instructor Velasquez had gathered the children into a tight group, and she was trying to keep them calm, but Maya could see the despair in her posture. The Karathi were not built for this kind of terrain. Their bodies were evolved for a world with gentle slopes and abundant water, and their legs were designed for swimming as much as walking. Jumping across gaps was not something their species did well, and Maya could see that even the oldest children in the group were looking at the distance to safety with obvious fear. "Can you jump?" Maya shouted across the fissure that now separated her from the main group. Instructor Velasquez looked at her with wide dark eyes that reflected Maya's own image back at her. The older ones, perhaps. The instructor called back, and her translator gave her voice a trembling quality that might have been accurate or might have been interpretation. "But the younger children cannot, and I cannot leave them." Maya looked at the gap between them. It was about 4 meters now, and it was slowly growing wider as the seismic event continued to destabilize the area. 4 meters was a significant distance for a standing jump, but Maya had run track in university, and she had grown up on Earth. With its heavy gravity that was nearly 1.5 times stronger than what she was experiencing on this little moon on Earth, Maya had been an average athlete at best, but here her muscles were working against much less resistance. She did not think about what she was going to do in terms of heroism or bravery. She thought about it in terms of simple problem solving. Children needed to get from point A to point B, and she was the only one who could make that happen. "Send the ones who can jump first," Maya called out. "I will catch them on this side, and then I will come back for the others." Instructor Velasquez stared at her for a long moment, and Maya could see the calculations happening behind those dark alien eyes. "Humans cannot," the instructor began, and her voice was filled with doubt. "The distance is too great for repeated crossings, and you will exhaust yourself. Watch me," Maya said, and she backed up several paces to give herself a running start. The first jump was almost easy. Maya sprinted toward the edge and launched herself across the gap, and she landed on the other side with room to spare. The Karathi children watched her with their mouths hanging open and their scales flickering through colors that Maya did not recognize. "Okay," Maya said to the group of frightened faces looking up at her. "Who can make the jump on their own?" 9 of the older children raised their hands with varying degrees of confidence. Maya nodded and pointed to the stable ground on the other side, where the 3 smallest children were still huddled together, one at a time. She instructed, "Jump as far as you can, and I will help you if you fall short." The first jumper was a gangly teenager whose scales were a deep blue color, and he made the leap with apparent ease. The second and third followed without trouble, but the fourth was smaller and more hesitant, and Maya could see that she was not going to make it all the way. When the child jumped, Maya was ready. She caught the small Karathi midair and swung her to safety in one smooth motion that she would later have no memory of executing. The remaining 5 who could jump all made it across with it. Maya's assistance, and now she turned to face the 14 children who could not make the crossing on their own. 14 children plus Instructor Velasquez, who was clearly not willing to leave her students behind. Maya looked at the gap, which had grown to nearly 5 meters now, and she took a deep breath and prepared to do something that the Karathi would later describe as impossible. She backed up and ran, and jumped back across to the island where the younger children waited. "Okay, little ones," she said with a smile that she did not entirely feel. "Who wants to go for a ride?" The first 2 children were twins named Keth and Rilla, and they weighed almost nothing in Maya's arms as she prepared to make the Jump, their scales were a matching shade of green that had turned almost white with fear, and they clung to Maya with a grip that was surprisingly strong for such small beings. "Hold on tight," Maya told them, and she felt them press their faces against her shoulders in response. "Do not let go no matter what happens." She backed up as far as the shrinking island would allow, and then she ran. The gap was 5 meters now and growing, and Maya's legs burned as she pushed off from the crumbling edge. For a moment she was flying through the air with 2 alien children clutched against her chest, and the darkness of the fissure yawning beneath her feet. She landed hard on the other side and stumbled forward, but she did not fall, and she did not drop. The children, Keth and Rilla, scrambled off of her and ran to join their classmates, and Maya was already turning back to face the next jump. Second trip, she carried a child named Voss, who was chubby and cheerful despite his terror, and who told her very seriously that she was the bravest human he had ever met. Maya did not mention that she was probably the only human he had ever met. The third trip, and the fourth, and the fifth, all blurred together into a rhythm of running and jumping and landing and returning. Each time the gap was wider than before, and each time Maya pushed her body harder than she thought possible. By the sixth trip, her legs were screaming with exhaustion, and her lungs were burning with every breath. The gap was now over 6 meters, and Maya could feel her confidence starting to waver. But there were still 8 children on that shrinking island, and Instructor Velasquez was watching her with an expression that mixed hope with disbelief. Maya jumped again. The 7th child was a tiny girl named Sela, who was so frightened that she had gone completely silent and limp. Maya had to hold her like a baby because the child could not grip on her own, and the added awkwardness made the landing rougher than the others. Maya's knee hit the ground hard, and she felt something tear in her pants and the warmth of blood beginning to seep down her leg. She did not stop to examine the injury. The 8th and 9th trips took 2 children each because Maya realized she could carry more if they were small enough, and the gap was now approaching 7 meters. Her hands were raw from gripping the edge of the stable ground and pulling herself up, and her arms trembled with every motion, but she kept going because what else could she do? The 10th trip was for a boy named Thrall, who was the largest of the remaining children and who apologized repeatedly for being too heavy. Maya told him to be quiet and hold on, and she jumped. She almost did not make it. Her feet hit the very edge of the stable ground, and she teetered backward for a heart-stopping moment before throwing her weight forward and tumbling onto safe soil. Thrall rolled away from her and burst into tears, and Maya lay on her back for just a few seconds, staring up at the sky and wondering if her legs would carry her through one more jump. They had to. There was 1 child left on the island with Instructor Velasquez, and Maya was not going to leave either of them behind. She forced herself to stand, and her legs felt like they were made of wet sand, but they held her weight. Gap was now nearly 8 meters, and the island had shrunk to a patch of ground barely large enough for the 2 remaining. Karathi, the stand-on Maya, looked at Instructor Velasquez and saw the instructor looking back at her with something that might have been awe or might have been pity. "You cannot make this jump," Velasquez said, and her voice was calm with the acceptance of someone who had made peace with her fate. "Take the child and go. I am taking both of you," Maya said, and her voice came out as more of a growl than she intended. "Get the kid on my back and hold on to my neck." Velasquez hesitated for only a moment before lifting the last child onto Maya's back. The little one wrapped her arms around Maya's neck, and Velasquez positioned herself to be carried under Maya's arm like an awkward bundle of scales and limbs. The total weight was more than Maya had ever carried while jumping, and the distance was farther than she had ever attempted. But the ground beneath Velasquez was cracking, and there was no time for doubt. Maya ran. She used every bit of strength left in her exhausted body, and she pushed off from the edge of the crumbling island with a scream that came from somewhere deeper than her lungs. The world seemed to stretch out before her as she flew through the air, and she could see the other sight approaching, but it was too far, and she was not going to make it. Her fingers caught the edge of the cliff, and her body slammed against the rock face with Velas's still clutched under her arm and the child still clinging to her back. For a terrible moment she hung there with nothing but her grip keeping all three of them from falling into the darkness. Her torn hands screamed with pain, and her arms burned with the effort of holding on, and she could feel her fingers beginning to slip. Then something grabbed her wrist. One of the older Karathi children had crawled to the edge and wrapped his webbed hands around Maya's arm, and he was pulling with all his strength. Another child joined him, and then another, and together they hauled Maya up over the edge. She collapsed onto the grass with Velas's and the last child tumbling off of her, and for a long moment she could not move at all. Her body had given everything it had, and there was nothing left. The ground was still shaking, and the crystal forest in the distance was groaning and collapsing, but Maya could not bring herself to care. She had done it all. 23 children were safe, and Instructor Velas's was safe, and Maya was lying on her back bleeding and bruised and more exhausted than she had ever been in her life. She started to laugh. It was a weak sound that turned into a cough, that turned into something that might have been crying, but she did not care. Around her, the Karathi children began to gather, and their small hands touched her arms and her face and her hair. They were saying things in their native language that the translator could not keep up with, but their tone was clear enough. One of the smaller children curled up against Maya's side and fell asleep almost instantly. Another began to braid her hair with clumsy fingers that had never touched human hair before. Emergency services would arrive 20 minutes later to find a human woman lying in the grass, surrounded by 23 Karathi children who refused to leave her side. When the medics asked Maya if she was injured, she looked at her torn hands and bloody knees, and the bruises already forming across her body. She looked at the children sleeping against her, and the ones holding her hands, and the ones still braiding her hair. "I am fine," she said. "Is everyone else okay?" That was the moment the medics realized they were dealing with something beyond an ordinary rescue. That was the moment the legend began. Maya spent 2 days in a Karathi medical facility, having her injuries treated and answering questions from local authorities. The doctors were fascinated by her physiology and kept muttering to each other about bone density and muscle fiber composition and cardiovascular capacity. Maya mostly slept. When she was finally released, she expected to return to her rented cabin and salvage what remained of her vacation. Instead, she found a crowd of reporters waiting outside the medical center. "Dr. Chan," one of them called out, as cameras and recording devices of various alien designs swung toward her face. "How does it feel to be the most famous human in the galaxy?" Maya blinked in confusion and wondered if she was still drugged from the medical treatment. It turned out that one of the older Karathi children had been recording the field trip for a school project. His name was Pelith, and he was 15 years old, and he had kept his recording device running throughout the entire disaster. Video was 17 minutes long, and it showed everything. It showed Maya sprinting across fracturing ground and leaping the initial fissure without hesitation. It showed her grabbing 3 children and scrambling up the edge of a collapsing sinkhole. It showed her jumping back and forth across an impossible gap 11 times while carrying children who were not her species and not her responsibility, and who she had never met before that day. The video had been uploaded to the Galactic network within hours of the rescue, and it had spread faster than any content in the history of interstellar communications within a single day. It had been viewed by more beings than the entire human population of Earth. Maya sat in her hospital room and watched the view counter climb past 10 billion, and she felt like she was watching something happening to someone else. The comments section was overwhelming. Karathi viewers were emotional and effusive in their gratitude, and thousands of them had posted messages thanking Maya and praising humanity as a species, but it was the reactions from other species that truly stunned her. Velthari were an ancient civilization that had been traveling the stars for over 100,000 years, and they were famously unimpressed by younger species. Their official government channel released a statement acknowledging Maya's actions as demonstrating remarkable physical capability and admirable disregard for personal safety, and this was apparently the highest praise they had given to any member of a new species in centuries. The Vesic were a warrior species who stood over 2 meters tall and were covered in natural armor plating, and they had dismissed humans as soft and slow ever since first contact. After the video went viral, the Vesic channels went conspicuously quiet, and Maya later learned that their military analysts had called an emergency meeting to reassess their evaluation of human capabilities. But the most significant reaction came from the scientific community. Biomechanics experts across dozens of species began analyzing Maya's jumps frame by frame. They calculated the force required to launch a human body plus cargo across distances of up to 8 meters. They estimated the muscle density and bone strength necessary to land those jumps without injury. They compared Maya's performance to known human athletic records, and they came to a conclusion that sent shockwaves through the galactic community. Maya Chen was not a remarkable human. She was a xenobiologist with no special athletic training who maintained a moderate exercise routine, primarily consisting of walking and occasional swimming. Her performance during the rescue was well within the normal range for a healthy adult human. In fact, by Earth standards, she would be considered only slightly above average. The implications of this discovery rippled outward through every species in the collective. If an ordinary human could do what Maya had done, then what could an extraordinary human do? Suddenly, every species in the galaxy was rewatching old human media with new eyes. They watched footage of human athletes performing feats that had previously been dismissed as camera tricks or exaggeration. They learned about marathon runners who covered distances that would kill most species, and they watched videos of weightlifters hoisting masses that seemed physically impossible. They discovered the existence of something called ultramarathons, where humans voluntarily ran for hundreds of kilometers through deserts and mountains and frozen wastelands just to see if they could. They read about human explorers who had climbed the highest mountains on Earth and crossed frozen continents on foot and survived disasters that should have killed them 10 times over. And they began to understand something that humans had always known but never thought to mention. Humans were endurance predators. They had evolved on a world with heavy gravity and harsh conditions, and they had survived by being too stubborn to die there. Bodies could operate for days without rest and could recover from injuries that would permanently disable most species. Their bones were dense and their muscles were powerful, and their cardiovascular systems were designed to sustain extreme effort for extended periods. And perhaps most terrifying of all, they had a psychological trait that other species found almost incomprehensible. Humans would risk their lives for strangers, not just for family members or allies or beings who might someday return the favor. For complete strangers of other species who they had never met and would probably never see again. The galaxy looked at Maya Chen, and they did not see a hero. They saw what humans called normal, and they were absolutely terrified. Maya watched all of this unfold from her hospital bed, and then from her rented cabin, and then from a series of interviews and appearances that she could not seem to refuse. Everyone wanted to talk to the human who had saved the Karathi children. Everyone wanted to understand why she had done it, and Maya kept giving the same answer over and over again because it was the only answer she had. They were kids. She would say with a shrug that seemed to confuse her interviewers, they were scared and they needed help, and what else was I supposed to do? This response only made things worse because the other species began to realize that Maya was not being modest or deflecting praise. She genuinely did not understand why anyone would have acted differently, and that was the most frightening thing of all. 3 months after the rescue, Maya found herself standing in the grand forum of the Galactic Collective, and she was fairly certain she was going to be sick. The forum was the largest gathering space in known civilization, and it could hold representatives from over 400 species simultaneously. Today, it was completely full. Maya was wearing the nicest clothes she owned, which meant a pair of clean field pants and a jacket she had borrowed from a colleague. Back on Tethys Station, everyone else was wearing elaborate ceremonial garments that probably cost more than her entire yearly salary. She felt profoundly out of place. The Korathi had nominated her for the collective's highest civilian honor, called the Wreath of Shared Light. It was awarded for exceptional service that crossed species boundaries and strengthened the bonds between different civilizations. No human had ever received it. No human had ever even been nominated. Maya had tried to refuse the honor about a dozen times, but the Korathi government had been insistent, and then the human diplomatic corps had gotten involved, and suddenly refusing was no longer an option. So here she was standing on a platform in front of 400 species, trying not to visibly tremble. The Korathi High Speaker was a dignified figure with deep purple scales and a voice that resonated through the chamber like music. Dr. Maya Chen. The speaker intoned, and the translator systems carried the words to every being in the room. You have been brought before this assembly to receive the Wreath of Shared Light for your actions on the garden moon of Velith 4. Maya tried to stand up straighter and probably failed. 3 months ago, you risked your life repeatedly to save 23 Korathi children who were strangers to you. The speaker paused and looked down at notes that glowed softly on the podium. When our investigators asked you why you did this, you gave an answer that has since been translated into over 6,000 languages and shared across every inhabited world in the collective. Maya felt her face growing hot with embarrassment. You said, and I quote, "They were kids and they were scared, and what else was I going to do?" A murmur rippled through the assembled representatives, and Maya wanted desperately to disappear. This answer confused many of us at first. The speaker continued. We thought perhaps the translation was incomplete, or that there was some cultural context we were missing. The speaker looked directly at Maya with those large dark eyes that seemed to see right through her. We have since come to understand that no context was missing, and that your answer was complete and sincere. The chamber fell silent. You did not save those children because you expected reward or recognition, or because you calculated that the benefits outweighed the risks. The speaker's voice grew softer somehow, and Maya thought she could hear something like wonder in it. You saved them because in that moment it did not occur to you to do anything else. Maya felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked hard to keep them from falling. We have spent the past 3 months studying humanity, the speaker said. We have watched your historical records and analyzed your biological capabilities and examined your psychological patterns. The speaker turned to address the full assembly. We found much that frightened us at first, and I will not pretend otherwise. Several species in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Humans are stronger than they appear, and more durable than seems possible, and more persistent than any species we have previously encountered. The speaker paused to let that sink in. But what we have come to understand is that these physical traits are not the most significant thing about humanity. The speaker turned back to face Maya. The most significant thing is what Dr. Chen demonstrated on Velith 4. Maya held her breath. Humans have evolved a trait that we can only call instinctive compassion. The speaker said, when they see another being in danger, their first impulse is not to calculate risk or consider consequences, or even to think at all. Their first impulse is to help. The speaker picked up the wreath of shared light from its ceremonial cushion and walked toward Maya. We have feared humanity's physical capabilities since first contact, and perhaps we were right to be cautious. The speaker placed the wreath around Maya's neck, and it was lighter than she expected and warm against her skin. But perhaps instead of fearing what humans can do, we should aspire to be what humans are. The chamber erupted in applause and sounds of approval that varied wildly from species to species. Maya stood frozen in place with tears now openly streaming down her face. She was supposed to give a speech. She had prepared remarks written by diplomatic professionals who knew how to say the right things to 400 different species. But when she opened her mouth, none of those words came out. "I keep hearing people say that what I did was special," she said, and her voice was shaky. But the translators carried it clearly throughout the chamber. "But it was not special, and I was not brave." She took a deep breath. "I was just there, and they needed help, and any human would have done the same thing." She looked out at the sea of alien faces watching her with expressions she could not fully read. "I know you are all very impressed by what happened, but I want you to understand something." Her voice grew steadier as she found her conviction. "There are 8 billion humans on Earth, and trillions more spread across our colonies, and if any one of them had been in my place, they would have jumped too." She gestured at the wreath around her neck. "This honor should go to my entire species because the only thing I did was be human." The silence that followed was so complete that Maya could hear her own heartbeat. Then the Karathi delegation rose to their feet, and they were followed by the Velthari and then the Vesic and then species after species. Until the entire chamber was standing, Maya did not know what to do, so she just stood there crying quietly while 400 species applauded her for being exactly what she had always been. That night in her temporary quarters, she received a message from Instructor Velas. Attached was a video file, and Maya opened it with trembling fingers. 23 Karathi children appeared on her screen, and they were holding up drawings they had made with whatever art supplies Karathi children used. The drawing showed a human figure with wild brown hair jumping across gaps and carrying small Karathi shapes to safety. Some of the drawings had words written on them in Karathi script that Maya could not read, but the translator helpfully supplied the meanings. "The jumping human who saved us, our human hero, Maya the Brave." And her favorite simply said, "Thank you." Maya laughed and cried and held her datapad against her chest like it was something precious. She thought about all the humans who would come after her into a galaxy that now looked at them differently. She thought about the expectations that had been placed on her species and the weight of being seen as heroes by default. She hoped they would all live up to it, but deep down, she knew they would, because being human meant never being able to walk past someone who needed help. It was not a choice, it was just who they were.